17 days before my stepdaughter's wedding, my husband sent me an email with a subject line that read, "Conditions for attendance." Not a phone call, not a conversation over coffee the way two people who've shared a marriage for over a decade might discuss something delicate. An email like I was a vendor who needed instructions. I remember sitting at my kitchen island coffee going cold in my hands, reading 5 numbered rules that would determine whether I was welcome at my own family's wedding. By the time I finished reading, I wasn't angry. I was calm in a way that frightened me a little, because I already knew exactly what I was going to send them instead. My name is Jessica Reed. I'm 46 years old, and for 12 years I believed I was building a family. I'm going to tell you what happened in the 17 days between that email and the wedding day itself, and what was inside the box I sent instead of showing up. But first you need to understand the 5 rules because they tell you everything about what kind of family I'd actually married into. The email came from Nicholas, my husband, 52, a man I'd once thought was the steadiest person I'd ever met. Steady, it turns out, is just another word for someone who never wants to rock a boat, even when the boat is sinking with you still inside it. The email opened with no greeting, just a line about wanting clarity before the big day, and then the list. First, I was to withdraw the civil claim I'd filed regarding the $420,000 I'd invested in Olivia's boutique 3 years earlier, money that had vanished along with the promised ownership papers that never materialized. Second, I was to sign a non-disclosure agreement promising never to discuss our family's finances with anyone ever for the rest of my life. Third, I was to transfer the deed to my lake cabin, a property I had purchased with my own money 5 years before I ever met Nicholas, into a new family trust that would ultimately benefit Olivia. Fourth, I was to contribute another $40,000 toward the wedding costs described in the email as proof of family unity. And fifth, I was to deliver a public apology at the reception, apologizing to the family for creating division. At the bottom, in a single sentence that I have read so many times I could recite it in my sleep, Nicholas wrote, "Follow all 5 or don't come." I sat with that sentence for a long time. I want to be honest with you about what I felt because I think a lot of people expect me to say I felt heartbroken, and maybe somewhere underneath everything I did there was heartbreak. But mostly what I felt was something closer to clarity. The kind of clarity that comes after years of squinting at something too painful to look at directly. And then one day the fog just lifts, and you see the whole shape of it. I saw in that moment the entire architecture of my marriage laid bare. I wasn't a wife, I was a resource. And resources don't get invited to celebrations. They get instructions. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that because I think it surprised even me. Instead, I opened my laptop and booked a week at a resort in Maui, the kind of place with an infinity pool that seems to spill directly into the ocean, private cabanas. A spa that smells like eucalyptus and quiet money. I booked it for the exact dates of Olivia's wedding weekend. Then I closed the laptop, made myself a proper cup of coffee, the good kind I usually save for weekends, and I called a courier service that specializes in secure professional deliveries. I spent the next several days preparing something. Not a rebuttal, not a screaming match disguised as a toast. Something quieter, and I think far more devastating than anything I could have said out loud in that ballroom. I won't tell you everything that was inside it yet because the order of things matters here. And I want you to understand the years that led to this moment before I show you how it ended. But I'll tell you this much. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't a check. It wasn't some petty gesture meant to embarrass anyone in front of their guests. It was something Olivia never expected anyone to actually put in writing. Something Nicholas never expected me to have the spine to send. And by the time that wedding day arrived, I wasn't in the room. I was 6,000 miles away, sitting by an ocean that didn't know or care about any of this, watching a live stream on my phone with my best friend Karen beside me, waiting to see what would happen when 300 wedding guests found out exactly what kind of family they'd been celebrating. But to understand why I did what I did and why I felt no guilt about it, you have to go back 12 years to the day I met Nicholas Reed and believed with my whole heart that I was about to become part of something worth building. That's where I need to start. I met Nicholas at a charity gala in Chicago 12 years ago, back when I still believed that the right kind of love could make up for almost anything. I was 34, recently divorced, cautious in the way you get after a marriage teaches you a hard lesson. Nicholas was different from anyone I'd dated. He had this steady, deliberate way of listening, like whatever you were saying was the most important thing in the room. He asked good questions. He remembered small details from previous conversations, the name of my childhood dog, the fact that I took my coffee with exactly 1 sugar. Looking back now, I understand that attentiveness can be its own kind of performance, but at the time, it felt like being seen for the first time in years. He had a daughter, Olivia, 15 years old, when we met, quiet and watchful in the particular way of teenagers who've lost their mother too young. Nicholas's first wife had died of cancer when Olivia was 9, and there was a fragility in both of them that I mistook in my naivety for an invitation. I wanted to help. I wanted to be useful to this family that seemed to need exactly what I had to offer, which at the time was stability, patience. And though I didn't fully realize it yet, money. I sincerely tried to be a good stepmother. I drove Olivia to soccer practice when Nicholas had late meetings. I sat through her school plays and helped her study for the SAT. I want you to understand that none of what came later erases those years, at least not in my memory. I loved her in the complicated way you love a child who isn't quite yours, but has still somehow become yours. That love is exactly why I didn't see what was happening to me until it was almost too late. It started small, the way these things always do. College tuition that Nicholas said we'd split, except somehow it was always my card that got charged when the semester bill came due. A first apartment in her sophomore year, security deposit and furniture because she just needs a little help getting started. Credit card debt that appeared out of nowhere in her senior year, $11,000. I paid off without much of a conversation, because Nicholas would look at me with this expression, half pleading and half expectant, and say the same phrase he always said. She's just getting started. I believed him. For years, I believed him. Every time Olivia made a financial decision I privately thought was reckless, an expensive trip disguised as networking a car she couldn't afford, a boyfriend she funded through 2 jobs she never actually worked, I told myself this was just what family did for each other. You catch people when they fall. That's the whole point of loving someone. The biggest fall came 3 years ago, when Olivia decided she wanted to open a boutique, a curated clothing shop, in a trendy part of the city. The kind of place with exposed brick and hand-lettered signage. She came to me directly, not through Nicholas, which I remember feeling touched by at the time. She sat across from me at my kitchen table with a business plan she'd clearly put real effort into, and she asked if I'd be willing to invest. I asked about ownership structure. I wasn't naive about that part, or so I thought. Nicholas assured me in a conversation I can still picture with painful clarity that I would be listed as a partial owner, that there would be formal paperwork, that this was a real investment and not a gift. I transferred the first installment within the week. Over the following 8 months, the total came to $420,000. My retirement contributions slowed. I dipped into savings I'd built for over a decade. But I told myself this was an investment in family and Olivia's future, in the kind of legacy that Nicholas and I would build together. The ownership documents never came. Every time I brought it up, Nicholas had a reason. The lawyer was slow. Olivia was overwhelmed with the store opening. There would be time to formalize everything once things settled down. I kept trusting him, because that's what 12 years of marriage does to your judgment. It wears down the part of your brain that's supposed to notice when something is wrong. My best friend Karen saw it before I did. We'd known each other since college, and she has never once been afraid to tell me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it. I remember sitting across from her at a wine bar downtown, telling her about the latest thing I'd paid for some emergency with the boutique's lease, and she set down her glass and looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. "Helping family isn't the same as financing them forever, Jessica," she said. I remember laughing it off. I told her she didn't understand the dynamics of blended families, that Nicholas and Olivia had been through so much loss, that this was just what love looked like when you were building something with people who'd already lost everything once. I ignored her warning completely. I think about that conversation often now, especially on quiet evenings, when I'm going through old bank statements and invoices tracing the exact shape of how much I gave and how little I ever asked in return. Karen was right, of course, she usually is, but it would take one more year and one more devastating discovery before I finally understood just how right she'd been, and just how much of my own life I had quietly signed away in the name of keeping the peace. 2 days after Nicholas's email arrived, I did something I probably should have done years earlier. I called a lawyer. Not a family friend who might soften the truth to protect the relationship, but a real attorney. Sharp and unsentimental, someone with no stake in keeping Nicholas and me on good terms. Her name was Melissa Grant, and I found her through a recommendation from a colleague who'd gone through her own difficult divorce. I sat in Melissa's office on a Tuesday afternoon with a folder full of documents I'd been avoiding for months, and I asked her to help me understand exactly what my husband was asking me to sign. Melissa read through everything twice: the trust paperwork, the NDA, the proposed deed transfer for my lake cabin. I watched her expression shift from professional neutrality to something sharper, more focused, the look of someone who has just noticed a pattern they weren't expecting to find. She set the papers down on her desk and looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. "Jessica, I need you to read this trust language very carefully," she said, sliding one document back toward me. "Do you understand what you'd actually be agreeing to here?" I didn't, not fully. That was the point, I think. The language was dense, wrapped in the kind of legal phrasing designed to be skimmed rather than understood. But Melissa walked me through it line by line. And what emerged was something far worse than 5 humiliating conditions for attending a wedding. Buried inside the trust paperwork was a clause stating that, by signing, I would permanently waive any future claims related to my investments in Olivia's boutique. Another clause released both Nicholas and Olivia from all liability connected to the missing $420,000. A third confirmed in writing that every dollar I had ever given this family had been a voluntary gift, not a loan, not an investment, nothing I could ever legally reclaim. I sat very still while Melissa explained it. I remember the particular quality of silence in that office, the hum of the air conditioning, the sound of my own heartbeat, which felt unusually loud in my ears. This wasn't about a wedding at all. The wedding was simply the occasion, the emotional leverage, the pressure point they were using to make me sign away years of financial abuse, in exchange for the privilege of watching my stepdaughter get married. "They're not inviting you," Melissa said, and I remember her voice was gentle but absolutely certain. "They're trying to buy your silence, and they're using a wedding to do it." I felt something shift in my chest when she said that. Not the sharp pain of betrayal, which I'd already been carrying for days, but something colder and more resolved. I told Melissa I wasn't going to sign anything. Not the NDA, not the trust documents, not the cabin transfer. I wasn't going to give another $40,000, and I certainly wasn't going to stand in front of 300 people and apologize for creating division, when the only thing I'd ever created was the financial foundation this entire family had been quietly standing on for over a decade. Melissa nodded, unsurprised, and then she asked me a question that changed the direction of everything that followed. "Do you have documentation? Everything. Every transfer, every email, every promise made about ownership." I did, as it turned out, more than I'd realized. 12 years of marriage generates a staggering paper trail when you go looking for it. Over the following days, I stopped reacting emotionally to the email sitting in my inbox and started working methodically instead. I want to be honest with you about what that process felt like, because I think people imagine some dramatic, tearful unraveling, and that isn't what happened. What happened was quieter, and in some ways far more unsettling for everyone involved, including me. I opened old email accounts I hadn't checked in years. I pulled bank statements going back a decade. I found the original text messages where Nicholas had promised in writing that I would receive formal ownership documents for the boutique investment. I found wire transfer confirmations for the tuition payments, the apartment deposit, the credit card payoff. I found voicemails I'd forgotten I'd saved, Nicholas's voice reassuring me that, "The paperwork is coming, I promise, just give the lawyer a little more time." Karen helped me organize everything chronologically, spreading documents across my dining room table, like we were building a timeline for a criminal case, rather than piecing together the financial history of a marriage. In a way, I suppose that's exactly what we were doing. I remember Karen looking up from a stack of invoices late one evening, exhaustion, and something like anger in her eyes. "Jessica, this isn't just carelessness. This is a pattern. This is deliberate." I nodded because by then I understood that too. 12 years of small compromises, of just this once, of she's just getting started, had built into something I could finally see clearly laid out on my dining room table. It wasn't a marriage that had drifted. It was a system that had been extracting from me for over a decade, and the wedding was simply its final, most audacious request. I made a decision that night, sitting across from Karen with coffee gone cold and papers spread between us. I wasn't going to argue with Nicholas. I wasn't going to call him screaming or beg him to see reason or try to explain to Olivia what she'd apparently never bothered to understand about where her boutique money had actually come from. Arguing gives people room to spin a story, to soften facts into feelings, to make everything sound like a misunderstanding between two people who love each other. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to document, and then I was going to let the documents speak for themselves in front of every single person who mattered to this family at the exact moment they least expected it. Karen and I spent the better part of a week at my dining room table going through everything with the kind of focus usually reserved for people building a legal case, which, in a sense, is exactly what we were doing. What we found went far beyond the missing ownership papers I'd already known about. It went into territory that made my stomach turn in a way I hadn't expected even after everything. The boutique's financial records, which Melissa had obtained through the discovery process once I'd officially filed my claim, told a story Olivia had never once mentioned to me. Of the $420,000 I'd invested, only about half had actually gone into the business itself, into lease payments, inventory, the build-out of that charming exposed brick storefront I'd visited exactly twice with genuine pride. The rest had been diverted. A 10-day trip to the Amalfi Coast, booked under the business account and labeled as a buyer's sourcing trip, though the itinerary Karen found buried in an old email showed beach clubs and dinner reservations, not a single supplier meeting. Designer handbags purchased through the boutique's corporate card, several $1,000s at a time, categorized in the books as inventory samples. A cosmetic procedure paid for in 2 installments directly from the business account filed under marketing consultation. And, most striking of all, part of the deposit for Olivia's own wedding venue had come from that same account, funneled through a series of transfers designed to look on paper like ordinary business expenses. I sat with that discovery for a long time. I want to tell you I was shocked, but honestly, by that point in the process, shock had started to feel like a luxury I couldn't quite afford anymore. What stayed with me instead was something quieter and more painful. This wasn't recklessness. This was a young woman who had learned very early and very thoroughly that money simply appeared when she needed it, and that no one in her life was going to ask hard questions about where it went. Nicholas knew. That was the part I had to sit with longest. Karen found a string of emails between Nicholas and several wedding vendors, a florist, a caterer, the venue coordinator, in which he'd repeatedly written some version of the same phrase. "Jessica will cover it." Not, "we'll discuss the budget." Not, "let me check with my wife." Just a flat assumption stated to strangers that I was a line item in his daughter's wedding budget, one he didn't feel any particular need to consult before spending. The discovery that affected me most, though, wasn't in an email or an invoice. It was something Karen found almost by accident scrolling through an old group chat Olivia had apparently forgotten, was still connected to a shared cloud backup from a phone she'd upgraded a year earlier. In it, talking to her bridesmaids about wedding costs, Olivia had written something I've thought about more times than I can count since. "Jessica's too soft. She'll sign anything if Dad asks." I read that sentence 3 times. I remember setting my phone down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something that might otherwise shatter if you weren't gentle with it. Karen reached across and put her hand over mine, and neither of us said anything for a while. There's a particular kind of grief in learning that the people you loved most weren't just careless with your generosity. They'd calculated it. They'd built a prediction model around your willingness to be used, and they'd been right about you for over a decade. I didn't cry, though. I want to be honest that I came close. What I felt instead was a strange, settling clarity, the same feeling I'd had reading Nicholas's 5 Rules 17 days earlier. I wasn't going to scream at anyone. I wasn't going to write an angry email demanding answers or call Olivia and ask her to explain herself or confront Nicholas across our kitchen island, the way I might have a year earlier, back when I still believed these conversations could lead somewhere honest. Instead, I decided to build something, not a confrontation, a presentation. I hired a designer. Karen recommended someone who normally built corporate pitch decks for tech startups, and I explained exactly what I needed. No insults, no emotional language, no accusations dressed up in dramatic fonts or angry red text. Just facts laid out with the same clean precision you'd expect from a quarterly earnings report. Dates, invoices, signatures, wire transfer confirmations side by side with the promises that had accompanied them. Screenshots of the group chat message presented without commentary, because I understood by then that the truth doesn't need decoration. It just needs to be visible. We worked through draft after draft. I insisted on removing anything that read as bitter or vindictive, anything that gave the impression I was doing this out of spite, rather than simply refusing finally to disappear quietly the way I'd been asked to. Slide by slide, the story built itself, chronological and undeniable, 12 years compressed into roughly 40 frames that anyone could understand within minutes, family member or stranger, financial expert or not. The final slide, the one I spent the longest time getting right, contained a single sentence, white text on a plain black background, no logo, no flourish. Love never requires deception. I looked at that slide for a long time after the designer sent the finished file. I thought about the 15-year-old girl I'd driven to soccer practice, the anxious college freshman I'd helped move into her first dorm room, the young woman across my kitchen table pitching me her business plan with genuine excitement in her eyes. I thought about how much of that girl might still exist somewhere underneath everything I'd just learned, and how much of what had happened wasn't entirely her fault, not when the adults around her had spent her whole life teaching her that consequences were something other people absorbed on her behalf. But understanding where deception comes from doesn't make it acceptable, and I had spent 12 years confusing my own understanding for an obligation to keep absorbing it. The presentation was finished. Now I needed the right moment to make sure it was seen. I learned about the gift ceremony almost by accident through a group text from Olivia's wedding planner that had apparently been sent to the wrong thread meant for a vendor coordination chat, but landing instead in a family logistics group I'd been quietly left on. The message described a special family gift moment planned for the reception, an elaborate tradition Olivia had apparently seen on a wedding planning show and decided to recreate. Before the first dance, immediate family members would present their gifts on a small stage set up beside the head table, opened one by one in front of all 300 guests, a curated little performance of love and generosity for everyone to witness. I read through the thread more carefully after that and found something that made the whole plan click into place with an almost eerie precision. Olivia had specifically requested that my gift be saved for last. Her exact words forwarded from an earlier message were something like, "Save Jessica's for the end, she always goes big." I sat with that phrase for a long moment. She expected diamonds or a car or some extravagant check with several zeros that she could hold up for the cameras while 300 guests applauded her stepmother's generosity one final time. She expected the pattern to continue exactly as it always had. I decided to give her something different. I ordered an elegant wooden keepsake box, hand-finished walnut with a simple brass clasp, the kind of object that looks expensive and dignified, sitting on a gift table, the kind of thing that gives absolutely no indication of what's actually inside until someone opens it. Inside, I placed several items I'd chosen with great care over the preceding days. A family photograph from years earlier, the 4 of us at a lake house vacation. Olivia, maybe 17, all of us smiling in a way that had once felt completely genuine to me. A short handwritten letter which I'll tell you more about later. A small flash drive containing the presentation Karen and I had built. and 4 sealed envelopes, each addressed individually in my own handwriting. One for Nicholas, one for Olivia, one for Ethan, her fiancé, and one for the family attorney who would be present as a witness to the trust signing that was supposed to happen that same weekend. I also did something Olivia herself had unknowingly made possible. Weeks earlier, before any of this had unfolded, she'd asked me to put together a tribute video for the reception, some kind of heartfelt retrospective, covering our years together as a family, the kind of sentimental montage set to music that plays while guests dab their eyes with cocktail napkins. I'd agreed to it back then, before the 5 rules, before Melissa's office, before I understood what I was actually dealing with. Now I sent the wedding planner a file. I told her it was the finished tribute video exactly as requested, cleared for the ceremony. She thanked me warmly and confirmed it would play automatically once the MC introduced the gift segment. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. I did not feel triumphant while I was doing any of this. I felt something closer to exhaustion, the particular tiredness that comes after finally putting down a weight you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten what your body felt like without it. There was no glee in packing that box. There was a kind of grief in it, actually, the grief of watching a chapter of your life end in exactly the way its foundation had always guaranteed it would. Karen flew with me to Maui 3 days before the wedding. I'd booked us a suite with a wraparound balcony overlooking the water, and on the first evening we sat outside with glasses of wine we barely touched, watching the sun drop into the ocean in that dramatic, almost theatrical way. Hawaiian sunsets manage streaks of orange and violet bleeding into the water like something out of a painting. Karen asked me gently if I was having second thoughts. I told her the truth. I wasn't having second thoughts about the presentation itself. What I was grieving was everything the presentation represented. 12 years I couldn't get back, a version of family I genuinely believed in, that had apparently never been real in the way I'd needed it to be. Karen didn't try to talk me out of that grief. She just sat with me in it for a while, the two of us quiet, the sound of the waves filling the space where words would have felt inadequate anyway. The morning of the wedding, I woke early, made coffee on the little balcony kitchenette, and did not get dressed for a ceremony I had no intention of attending. Instead, I opened my laptop and confirmed the livestream link Nicholas's cousin had set up for family members who couldn't travel, something originally intended for an elderly aunt in Florida who used a wheelchair and rarely left home. I logged in quietly under a name that wouldn't draw attention, and I waited. Karen sat beside me on the balcony with her own coffee, the ocean stretching out gold and enormous behind my laptop screen, and neither of us said very much. There wasn't much left to say, honestly. Everything I needed to communicate was already inside that walnut box, already loaded onto a flash drive that would begin playing the moment someone pressed the wrong button at exactly the right time. I remember looking at the time on my laptop, watching it click toward the hour the ceremony was scheduled to begin, and feeling my heartbeat pick up, despite the calm I'd worked so hard to hold on to. Whatever was about to happen in that ballroom 6,000 hours away, I wasn't going to be in the room for it. But for the first time in 12 years, I finally felt like I was the one controlling how my own story would be told. The livestream connected a little after 4 in the afternoon Hawaii time, which put it deep into the evening back in Chicago. Karen and I sat side by side on the balcony laptop, propped on a small table between us, the screen showing a ballroom I recognized instantly, even through the slightly grainy resolution of someone's phone camera mounted near the back of the room. Crystal chandeliers, white orchids on every table, 300 guests in formal wear, the low hum of conversation, and clinking glasses filling the audio feed. It looked, I remember thinking, exactly like the kind of wedding that photographs beautifully and means almost nothing underneath the surface. Olivia looked radiant. I'll give her that, and I mean it without any bitterness. She wore a fitted ivory gown, her hair swept back in soft waves, and she was laughing at something a bridesmaid had said, completely unaware of what was sitting in a walnut box on the gift table 20 feet away from her. Nicholas stood near the head table in a charcoal suit, beaming in that proud, self-satisfied way he got at events where everything appeared to be going according to plan. The MC, a cheerful man in his 30s with a wireless microphone, announced the gift ceremony a little after the first course had been cleared. I watched Nicholas step up to a small platform near the head table, gesturing warmly toward the gift table, as he introduced the tradition Olivia had planned. He talked briefly about the family's generosity over the years, and then with what I can only describe as genuine pride in his voice, he said something that still sits strangely with me every time I think about it. He mentioned my name, told the room I'd prepared something special, and said he couldn't wait for everyone to see it. Olivia walked to the gift table with her new husband's arm looped through hers, though of course he wasn't her husband yet, not for another 20 minutes according to the schedule. She opened a few other gifts first, an envelope from an aunt, a framed piece of artwork from Nicholas's business partner, polite applause following each one. Then she reached the walnut box. I watched her lift the lid, watched her expression shift from anticipation to mild confusion as she pulled out the photograph first, the four of us at the lake house all those years ago. She smiled at that, held it up briefly for the cameras, said something about happy memories that I couldn't quite make out over the room's ambient noise. Then she found the letter and I watched her read the first few lines, her smile faltering slightly, her eyes moving faster down the page. That's when the tribute video began. It started automatically exactly as I'd arranged, with the wedding planner projected onto the large screen mounted behind the head table, the same screen that had presumably been showing a slideshow of family photos earlier in the evening. The first slide appeared. A simple title card. A Family History in Documents. The room's chatter dimmed slightly as guests turned their attention toward the screen, expecting sentiment, expecting the kind of soft-focus nostalgia these videos usually deliver. What appeared instead were investment records. Clean, professionally formatted slides showing the $420,000 I'd transferred into Olivia's boutique, followed by a screenshot of the original text message where Nicholas had promised formal ownership documents. The next slide showed the boutique's actual financial records, the Amalfi Coast trip, the designer handbags, the cosmetic procedure, each one labeled clearly beside its corresponding falsified expense category. Then came the emails, vendor after vendor, Nicholas writing the same 4 words, "Jessica will cover it," dated across nearly a year of wedding planning I'd never once been consulted on. I could hear the room's reaction through the live stream before I could fully process what I was seeing on my own screen. A rising wave of murmurs, someone gasping audibly near the microphone chairs, shifting as guests leaned toward each other. Ethan, standing beside Olivia at the gift table, turned to look at the screen with an expression I could read clearly even through the grainy footage, confusion sliding rapidly into something harder. The screenshot of Olivia's message to her bridesmaids appeared next, white text against black, unmistakable. "Jessica's too soft. She'll sign anything if Dad asks." I watched Olivia's face when that slide filled the screen behind her. She didn't move. She just stood there, box still in her hands, as 300 people read words she'd apparently forgotten she'd ever written. Ethan asked the question I imagine everyone in that room was thinking. I heard it clearly through the microphone still clipped somewhere near the head table. "Is this true?" Nicholas moved toward the projection equipment, almost immediately fumbling with a laptop near the DJ booth, clearly trying to stop the video before it reached whatever came next. I watched him gesture frantically to the wedding planner, a woman in a black dress with a headset who'd been standing near the edge of the room the entire time. Her response was calm, professional, and utterly devastating in its simplicity. I could see her mouth the words even before the nearby microphone picked them up clearly enough for the stream's audio to catch. Mrs. Reed approved this presentation herself. The room went quiet after that, in a way that felt almost physical, a silence with weight to it. 300 people absorbing the fact that the woman who'd apparently just detonated this wedding wasn't even in the building. Olivia set the box down on the table very slowly, her hands visibly unsteady, and for a long moment she simply stood there under the chandeliers in her ivory gown, while the final slide of the presentation filled the screen behind her. "Love never requires deception." I watched her read it. I watched something in her posture collapse slightly, not dramatically, not the kind of theatrical breakdown you'd see in a movie, just a small human deflation, the look of someone realizing that everyone she loved most had just watched the truth arrive without her permission. Karen reached over and turned the laptop volume down slightly, not off, just down, and neither of us said anything for a long time. The ocean kept moving behind us, indifferent and enormous, while 6,000 miles away a wedding I'd spent 12 years unknowingly financing came to a complete and silent stop. The live stream ran for another 20 minutes after the presentation ended, though very little of it resembled a wedding reception anymore. There was no shouting, at least not that the microphone picked up clearly. No dramatic music swelling underneath a confrontation the way you might expect if this were a movie instead of my actual life. What I watched instead was quieter and in its own way far more devastating. Guests sitting in stunned silence, a few standing and quietly making their way toward the exits, unwilling to stay for a celebration that had just revealed itself to be built on something they no longer wanted to witness. Nicholas moving between tables, attempting explanations that visibly weren't landing, his face flushed in a way I recognized from years of watching him manage crises that were in one way or another always someone else's fault. Ethan was the one who ultimately stopped everything. I watched him walk to the small platform near the head table, take the microphone gently from the MC's hand and address the room directly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform outrage for the cameras still recording on dozens of phones throughout the ballroom. He simply said that he needed to postpone the ceremony, that he cared deeply for Olivia, but couldn't in good conscience marry someone whose future, by her own admission in writing, had been built through years of calculated deception toward a woman who'd only ever tried to help her. Several guests applauded quietly, an uncomfortable scattered sound. Most simply began gathering their things. I turned off the live stream not long after that. There's a point where watching stops being necessary and starts becoming something closer to voyeurism, and I didn't want to cross that line, not even after everything. Karen and I sat on the balcony as the sun continued its slow descent into the ocean, neither of us saying much, the enormity of what had just happened settling over both of us in its own time. Over the following months, I learned the rest secondhand through Melissa, through mutual acquaintances, through the occasional text from Karen, who'd stayed more connected to the family gossip than I had any interest in remaining. Olivia lost the boutique within 4 months, her business partner withdrawing once the financial irregularities became impossible to ignore. Several friendships dissolved quietly, the kind of social fallout that happens when people realize they'd been cheering for someone's generosity while she was actively deceiving the person providing it. Nicholas, facing my civil claim with an attorney far less prepared than Melissa, was ultimately forced to liquidate several assets, including a vacation property he'd always been particularly proud of, to settle what he owed me. Through court-approved mediation, I recovered a significant portion of my original investment, not all of it, but enough to feel like the record had finally been set straight. Nicholas reached out to me repeatedly in the months that followed. Texts at first, then longer emails, then eventually a formal request through Melissa's office asking if I'd be willing to meet in person. I said yes eventually, though I want to be honest that I didn't do it out of any lingering hope for reconciliation. I did it because I thought I owed myself the closure of hearing whatever he needed to say directly, rather than filtered through months of second-hand accounts and legal correspondence. We met at a quiet coffee shop, neutral ground somewhere neither of us had ever been together before. He looked older than I remembered, though it had only been a few months, tired in a way that suggested the last year had cost him more than money. He apologized in his way, though. Even then I noticed he framed things carefully, talking about wanting to keep the peace and protect the family, rather than naming directly the years of financial harm he'd allowed and quietly encouraged. I thought keeping the peace mattered most, he said, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. I remember the moment clearly, the way the afternoon light came through the window behind him, the ordinary hum of a coffee shop that had no idea it was hosting the final conversation of a 12-year marriage. I didn't feel angry anymore by that point, which surprised me. What I felt was a kind of settled certainty about something I hadn't fully understood until I said it out loud. Peace built on someone else's sacrifice isn't peace, I told him. It's just quiet exploitation with better manners. He didn't have a response to that. We finished our coffee mostly in silence, and I haven't spoken to him since, beyond what's strictly necessary through our attorneys. A year to the day after that wedding that never finished, I found myself back on that same Maui beach, alone this time, Karen having flown home a few days earlier for her own family obligations. I walked along the shoreline as the sun began its familiar descent, the water warm around my ankles, and I thought about the woman I'd been 12 years earlier sitting across a gala table from a charming widower, believing so completely that love meant giving until it hurt and calling the hurt devotion. I don't believe that anymore. I've learned slowly and at real cost that love that requires your erasure isn't love at all. It's a transaction dressed up in family language, designed to make the person doing the giving feel guilty for ever noticing the imbalance. The gift I sent that day wasn't cruelty, and it wasn't revenge, no matter how some people in that family have chosen to describe it since. It was simply the first completely honest thing I'd offered any of them in over a decade. Some people build their lives around keeping quiet to preserve a fragile peace. I finally understood that some peace isn't worth preserving at all. If you've made it this far with me, I want to know what you think this story was really about. Was I right to send that gift, or do you think there was a gentler way through all of this? I'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight, and what you would have done in my place. Subscribe and stay close. There are more journeys like mine still to come, and I don't want you to miss a single one.